Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Switch Statement Podcast. It's a podcast for investigations into miscellaneous tech topics.
This is our 20th episode on Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter.
Hey, John, how you doing?
Hey, Matt, how are you?
I am doing all right. I didn't realize we were reading a book about molecular biology.
Yeah, no, this chapter had some wild turns.
Literally, there's just all sorts of DNA twists in it.
Yeah. No, I thought this was, this is kind of like, first of all, this is just a completely fascinating topic. Like, I read a book a while ago now called Song of the Cell, which was a very good book, which kind of really dived deeply into this stuff. And you do get this sense, I don't want to completely reveal the purpose of this chapter, but you get the sense that biology is a computer. Like, it's performing instructions. It has, it has data and functions, which is kind of like the DNA of all computer languages.
The data is functions.
Maybe the data is functions.
Are data.
Yeah.
So we start this chapter off kind of where we left off, talking about self-reference, and then we immediately get into self-replication. I guess as a more sneaky way to accomplish self-reference, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was an interesting transition because he sort of starts with a little bit of like linguistic exercises.
Right.
I actually thought this chapter was going to be like light reading at first, which is hilarious. Yeah. But, he started just sort of describing like, this sentence is false for the millionth time in this book. But he did describe a concept that I thought was interesting, which is like how much of the self-reference is encoded in the language itself.
Yeah. Versus
like the processing or parsing of the sentence. Like, in other words, you could create a programming language, and this was an example he gave, but you could create a programming language where you just type in asterisk, and like by simply typing that asterisk, you've created a program that prints itself. But that's like completely uninteresting, right? Because all of the self-reference is kind of encoded into the compiler. And he's sort of getting at, you want something that more fundamentally self-represents itself within the procedure itself, sort of the abstract procedure itself, which he sort of, I don't know if you read into this the same way, but it was like, I feel like his claim was that that's what Gödel's incompleteness is. Like, it's a fully agnostic, self-referential construct that's fully agnostic of like the language it's being represented in.
I guess this ties into his inner message and outer message. Like, this is this pure inner message that's completely divorced from any outer representation of it.
Exactly. At least this was my reading, is that he gave all these linguistic constructs where, like, he even criticizes the use of the phrase "this sentence," because it's kind of like, as an English reader, you have to like do all this processing in your brain to sort of understand what this sentence even means. You have to read the whole sentence for one thing in order to understand what this sentence even means. So a lot of the encoding of the self-reference is like within the processing of, the English words, as opposed to like within the, the algorithm itself.
But that's
hard to explain.
That's always true in these like recursive situations where, like, and we actually have experienced this firsthand. We wrote a tiny little toy programming language, and you need to build up a certain amount of structure before you can do things like reference a function from within itself.
Right.
And I think it's not too different from the amount of like English language understanding you need to parse the phrase, this sentence.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely true. You need some amount of substrate in order to build these constructs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It was interesting. It was the first time I'd seen him talk about this whole like where it's almost like where is the self reference? Like, is it in the execution of the of the procedure, or is it within like the syntax of the procedure? I don't even know what to call it. Like,
It's funny because, and maybe this isn't true, but there always has to be a context in order for self reference to have any effect, right? Because it's like the context for us is our brain. And we
uh-huh.
read this sentence and then like we stick it somewhere. And then we keep on like consuming tokens and then we arrive at some complete understanding of what the sentence means.
Yeah. So
And
so there is a significant amount of context there.
so I think is that, and you're saying the self-reference exists in both. You need both parts, I guess, in order for there to actually be a self-reference.
I think so, because he gave two analogies. One was an iceberg where you have, the iceberg, I think, is the asterisk program where it's like you have this little tip, which is self reference. But in order to like fully represent the self reference, you need this like lower part of the iceberg, which is the compiler. And then he gave this soap example where there's like a bar of soap floating in the water where most of the soap is above the water. And that was more, I can't remember what that example was.
That
Maybe it was,
referred to yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, which is so funny because he's like, yeah, you only need half a bar of soap's worth of processing to understand yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation. And I'm
yeah.
like, I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah. It's interesting. You kind of have to like really take what he's saying about the phrase this sentence. It's like you have to kind of agree with his premise that like this sentence is a highly costly construct.
I think it's that it's a much more abstract.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas like that, there's no abstract references that you need to unpack.
Yeah,
It's just a
exactly.
literal, yeah.
Right. It's like this sentence is that lower part of the iceberg, whereas yields falsehood. I can't remember what it is. Yields
When
falsehood.
preceded by his quotation.
Yeah. So anyway, this is how the chapter started with these sort of like linguistic wordplay type things. He also gave this Nickelodeon example, which I kind of liked, where, and I guess a Nickelodeon are those things where you like press a letter and a number and it plays a song.
Dude, I wanted to ask you, were you young enough to like, did you watch Nickelodeon the channel when you were growing
Oh
up?
yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Stickly.
Stickly, I don't know. I don't get that one.
Pete and Repeat, was that, or Pete and Pete?
There was definitely Pete and Pete, which I know one of the Pete's. Like
No
I
way.
went to school with his sister. Yeah, little Pete. His sister was in my grade.
No way, dude. You know Little Pete. How's Little
Yeah,
Pete doing?
he's doing well. He wrote a book. I hadn't read it, but I went to one of the book signings. I have a picture of my girlfriend with little Pete. I mean, he's old now, but he
Yeah,
was little Pete.
he's Big Pete now.
But anyway, yeah, Pete and Pete, good show.
Good show. Kind of a precursor of like, I want to say it shared a lot of similar DNA with shows that I love, like Twin Peaks. Like it was just kind of this really weird, realism, surrealism mixture.
It was weird. Yeah, there was a lot of unusual stuff going on there.
Yeah.
But so we have a Nickelodeon in the original sense, like you're talking about.
Oh, right. Okay. So yeah, sorry, I don't want to take too long with this anecdote, but basically Nickelodeon, where you press a letter and a number and it plays a song, and if there's a song in there that says the song itself, the lyrics of the song says press 11U to play this song. And then you listen to that song, and so you press 11U, and then it plays that song. So anyway, this is self-reference. Like, it just repeats the song over and over again, using you as sort of like a mesmerized automaton to keep playing it.
Right.
But he mentions how this is more where the 11U is like a trigger of the self-reference, where,
Yes.
and he's sort of, comparing that to Gödel's incompleteness, where the self-reference is in the procedure itself. So I think it was just another example of that whole, like, where actually is the self-reference? Like, is it? Yeah, go ahead.
And it's interesting because the self-reference, like the things that are being reproduced, are the song and the action.
Yeah.
But you still have, I think if we're kind of trying, you keep on going back to this context, you still have the person and the jukebox that are enabling those replications.
Yes.
And they're just triggering each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's a massive amount of like iceberg happening here.
Yeah.
But still, an interesting example. Yeah. One last example on this, like, compiler self-reference stuff. Kimian self-representation,
Dude,
which I
I'm
which I
glad you
thought was
brought this
fun.
up.
Kimian is where, as your computer program, you basically type the error that the compiler produces when it reads your program. So, like, I think when you have an invalid program in C++, it just says, like, syntax error when you try to compile it. So if you literally just opened a file and typed syntax error and then did GCC, it would print syntax error. So it's like you've used a detail of the error handling of
Yeah.
the compiler to create self-representation, which I just thought was kind of awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of getting at a Quine from the side.
Yeah.
But there was I had a point here about inner messages versus outer messages where I was thinking about, well, actually, you referenced Twin Peaks. I feel like all of David Lynch's works are like master classes of like the outer message, not really, or it just being very unclear, like what the inner message is from the outer message. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, for one, I completely agree. I think David Lynch is one of the most, like, well, first of all, he's one of the most hard to understand filmmakers.
Yeah.
He has several films where you can watch the whole entire thing, like Eraserhead, perfect example. You watch the whole film and you're like, what did I just watch? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And so you can read about the film, you can sort of read what he said about it, you can read what critics have said about it, and there's a lot of different potential meanings for that film. Like a harm to the environment, or like, even I've even heard people talk about climate change. People talk about like love, how love works, because there's obviously the element of Eraserhead where there's like the child
Yeah.
and abortion and all these, highly weighty and interesting topics. But just watching the film, you don't really get that unless you're sort of guessing at what the meaning might be.
Yeah. I mean, you need to really take a step back from what you're watching
Yeah.
and like, and you obviously you just start to get all these themes when you're like removing the particulars and you're just like, okay, what am I looking at? And then now this is this theme that he kind of wants you to think about. It's like, oh, like what is he experiencing when he sees this like crazy looking child, or what have you?
Yeah. Which I think, I mean, he did his job as a filmmaker. He's like challenging the viewer, which I think a lot of filmmakers intentionally don't do that. Like,
Oh yeah.
certainly, if you think about movies like the Marvel franchise or whatever, like, those movies aren't trying to challenge you at all. They're just trying to give you a spectacle. And I think David Lynch, he's a true artist. He did his job. He challenged us.
He explicitly disavows conclusion. Like he's like,
Yeah.
nope, you should there or maybe resolution. There might be a conclusion, but nothing's resolved.
Yeah. Which is
But
the way it should be, because that's how life is. That's how reality is.
like, well, yeah, but yeah, so many things, right? It's like, what the hell? Like the JFK assassination. There's no resolution.
Yep.
All right, but maybe we get back, start to dive in heads first into the chemistry, the
Yeah.
biology.
The real meat of this chapter, and in some ways, the culmination of so many little seeds he's laid along the way. I feel like
Oh
these
yeah,
last few chapters we've been reading, he's been really calling back to earlier chapters and sort of showing us how he's tying everything together. But we're talking
yeah.
about typogenetics, which is kind
Okay,
of, I guess was his term for it, where, and this is sort of harkening back to typographical number theory, but this is with genetics, where you have strands of, you know, letter codes like Gattaca,
yeah,
GATC. Those are the four, right?
yeah,
GATC.
yeah. And I mean U for messenger RNA, but we'll get to that.
Right. And then you have enzymes, which are a sequence of amino acids, which he likens to commands. So each, there's this series of, I want to say 16 or so amino acids, which are each commands that when when this command encounters one of these strands of like GATC characters, it performs certain actions. Like it deletes one of the characters or it converts one of the characters to another. And then and then basically, so you have those enzymes, they operate on a strand of, is it of DNA? Is that what
Well,
he was calling it?
this is what's confusing. I don't. Yeah, I mean, you are operating on this strand of DNA, but the operations are these fundamentally typographical. So he's kind of like mixing metaphors a little bit here. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
it is a strand of DNA. Those like four nucleotides.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I feel like I'm going to use the wrong terminology a few times, and yeah, feel free to correct me. But this strand of DNA goes into this series of amino acids, which is an enzyme. And based on those commands that each amino acid represents, it produces a new strand of DNA. But then that new strand of DNA gets broken up into what he calls base pairs. And depending on the base pair, you can use this little table that he made to determine which command that base pair represents. So basically, what's happening here is you have this strand, it's going into an enzyme, it's producing a new strand, but that new strand actually represents a new enzyme or program that can then be run against other strands.
Right. And I mean, so we're getting into this. I mean, this is kind of the building of the context, as we're talking about before, where this is now how you have something that both represents a program, but also like can operate on itself essentially.
Right. Yeah. Is it data or behavior? It's both. Kind of like
Right.
what you were saying earlier. And yeah, I guess one last thing is also in this table that he gave, which is basically the base pair, where the rows of the table is like the first thing in the base pair and the columns is the second thing. In each of the cells of this table is also I can't remember what he called it, like a winding parameter almost,
Right.
which basically tells you how that strand twists. And so you also end up with what he calls this tertiary structure, which, by the way, we'll learn in just a moment that all of these terms that he's introducing are also terms in biology. He's giving us like this very high level abstraction of how actual biology works.
Right.
Where,
Which is funny because in this context, the tertiary structure doesn't do anything though. Is that correct? Like we haven't been shown anything that the tertiary structure effect that a tertiary structure has.
exactly, yeah, he just sort of mentions that like, oh, there's this tertiary structure, and then he sort of moves on. But we will get to, and this was something I thought was hilarious about this chapter, where he mentioned this type of genetics, and he was like, "Oh, I'm just going to give you a very high level like description of how biology works because biology is complicated and I don't want to talk about it." And then he immediately starts talking about like actual biology and really getting into the nitty gritty detail of like how actual biology functions, which is like incredibly complex.
Right. And I guess, I don't know. I'm not sure I needed typo whatever it was. Sorry, let me look. What's the word?
Type
Typo
of genetics.
genetics. I'm not sure that he adds that much by going through this process. I mean, okay, I guess if you have someone who is not at all familiar with biology, like never took biology and hasn't learned like the fundamentals of genetics, like this might be a useful step along the way. But especially given that he then goes on to talk about the real science
Yeah.
of genetics, like why spend that time? Just go jump there immediately.
Right. Especially since like everything he talks about in type of genetics is basically like a vastly simplified version of what he then goes on in great detail to describe. So
Yeah.
it's like, why? I mean, I understand, introduce a concept in a simple way and then talk about the actual complexities and nuance of it. But yeah, I think he could have just skipped right to actual biology. But
One
in any case, oh yeah, go ahead.
one interesting point he makes, and I'm not sure I completely understand what he's saying, but he talks about the fact that old information in this type of genetics, like old information is flowing upwards, where it's kind of saying, like, okay, the old information is sticking around, but then new information, like one of these procedures is just like, I guess, modifying old information in such a way that like it all kind of remains there. But then the other one is creating new information.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually kind of this essential part of self-reference, and how any of this actually works is because at some point in time something gets created and it sticks around, like it is still floating around and it is able to have some effect on this other thing.
Yeah.
Because if it were this truly like back and forth situation where like one thing was destroyed as soon as the other thing was created,
Yep.
that would kind of put a limitation on how, because then you lose the code. But now it's like, okay, cool, well, we have both the thing that it created and we have the code too, and so this is kind of essential to continuing this cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like he touches on this a little bit. Like there's a few like subheadings towards the end of his description of biology. One that was really interesting is he sort of talks about like, okay, now we have all these rules of biology, but like, how do you end up with an elephant?
Yeah.
It's like, how does this simple processing of DNA like ladder up basically to this like utterly complex organism where parts of it are, sort of static, like you're saying, like organs stick around. They're not constantly being destroyed and regenerated. I mean, obviously little parts of them are, but how does that happen? And he gives a couple examples of, I think he calls it repression, where biology has these mechanisms where it can basically stop certain processes from happening. And he also mentions what I think is one of the most important details of this chapter. And I think you dropped a hint to it earlier, where he talks about how biology is very context aware. Like he gives these rules that sort of feel like they can just happen in isolation. But the reality is that like these proteins, which by the way, a protein is the actual outcome of like actual biology, where you get this, you pass what is it, a mr or r or sorry mRNA passes through a ribosome and amino acids are produced, which then produce a protein based on these folding rules.
Right.
Proteins are these utterly complicated things. In fact, he mentions in this book that it's an unsolved problem to determine how a protein is actually folding, which is kind of hilarious because Google DeepMind just a few years ago basically solved this problem.
Basically solved it. Yeah, AlphaFold.
Yeah, so this was one of the greatest problems on the frontiers of biology, and this problem has been solved. Newsflash, I guess. But in any case, based on these tertiary structures, molecules can land on these proteins at what are called these activation sites. And when molecules land on these proteins, these extremely complex physical interactions take place, like literally molecular interactions. Some are chemical interactions, but some of them are actually molecular, like electrons being negatively charged and whatever, attracting or pushing other electrons away and whatnot. But the key is that all of this takes place within an environment, which that environment is having an effect on the outcome of these interactions. So you might have cells in your liver that are extremely similar to cells in your lung, but they actually behave in a way that's quite different because their sort of respective environments are completely different.
One of the things that's crazy about what you're describing is you wind up with a system like just you talked about the context. One of the things you need all of this to take place in is water, right? It's kind of all of this stuff is happening in I guess they call it the cytoplasm of the cell. And it's so wild because all of these cells are working together and they are, through their collaboration, like making this enormous organism feel thirsty and then like tell it to go drink water so that it can have it can have water that it like to have these substrates. So it's like very indirectly, like extremely indirectly, it's providing its own context, which is just wild to me. Because you need to have this like self-reinforced. You need the context. It needs water. You need this thing to drink.
Right. So yeah, it's insane. It's insane. This is, I mean, I'll mention again Song of the Cell just because it's a great book. But this is what Song of the Cell was all about. It's just like how these utterly complicated, rules and systems, like biology is just insanely complicated. Like it's got to be one of the, I mean, I've observed computing systems that have like layer upon layer upon layer where there's all these like, interdependent interactions where the state of some server can affect the calling of some endpoint, but it pales.
It cannot possibly hold a candle. Like it's like, yeah, same. I was just about to repeat basically what you were saying, but it's like I've worked on incredibly complicated systems. I spent a little bit of time looking this up this morning, and I can just tell that it's just two different animals in terms of complexity.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is like biology is governed by natural selection, right? So it's not like biology is making decisions. Like it's just whatever survives lives on. So the quote unquote design of biology is utterly organic. It's not like in a software system, you typically have like a human being who's sort of architecting that system, like taking parts of the system that are complex and trying to simplify them, taking parts of the system that, people struggle to use and trying to make them more user-friendly. That doesn't happen in biology. Biology is just stack upon stack of like ridiculously complex things that all layer up to make the elephant drink water.
I don't know. I've seen some of Google systems. Feels like a lot of stacks of random shit on top of each other in a pretty organic way.
Yep. No, well, and then maybe this is what happens when you have a company of 115,000 engineers all creating interdependent systems, is you basically achieve biology.
Like a superorganism, yeah.
But this is part of, and it's funny because I feel like this is the crux of this chapter is, Douglas Hofstadter he's trying to show that like we are computers. Like biology is a set of formal rules which can be fully understood. And, we've mentioned all of this context aware stuff, which makes it extremely difficult. to understand it. But it's like, we know how these subatomic particles work. We sort of know how proteins work. We know that if a protein is folded in this way, that it'll have these activation sites. All of this can be found out, and these rules can be sort of like, run in a program, and there's like determinism there. So I think that's what he's getting at, is like, we are computers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, and to that point, so I guess it makes sense to take a step back and just explain how real biology is just subtly different from, and I think you already did this, but like, so we had typo genetics. Well, real genetics, instead of each one of these operations being like slicing up a word or duplicating a letter, you're folding this it's, you have three DNA base pairs, so it's called a codon, and that maps onto a particular amino acid. And then I think you said this, those amino acids, they link together in this long chain, and they fold at these different angles, and they make this shape with these activation sites, right? So
right, yeah, the tertiary structure.
The tertiary structure. So the thing that was crazy to me is, where is the mapping? Like, the part that seems the most arbitrary to me, like that it just seems like some random thing, is how those 3-letter sequences, those codons, are mapping onto any one of the amino acids. Because it wasn't clear to me how that was happening. It's just like, okay, this is just a lookup table. It's literally just a lookup table in the,
Well, and I think that's where it starts to just get into how chemistry works, or how physics works, even, where it's like, if you have this, this like atom, and you put it next to this atom, like this thing will just happen. Like, it's just a universal law of the universe.
I don't think that's true, actually, because we've seen, or in experiments, scientists have made organisms with modified codons. Like, I think it's actually just this happened, this particular mapping happened, and what happened is things things were relying on this particular mapping. And so if an organism came along that started to use a different mapping, they would just die, or they would just never exist, because all the proteins would be wrong.
So you're saying that mapping is somewhere in like the nucleus or something, or like it just is and it'll use that mapping as a lookup table with these codons.
Essentially, but in experimental organisms, scientists have modified that mapping. They've picked different, because, and I spent way too long, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. I spent a bunch of time like trying to figure out where that mapping is. But basically, the way this looks is it's this long molecule, which there's the codon here, and then there's the and I'm like making, so there's the codon at the bottom, or they call it the anticodon at the bottom, and then there's the amino acid at the top. And there's really no interaction between the two. And it's just by dint of the fact that there's actually another enzyme that's sticking these two things together somewhere else. And then it just so happens that these two things are the only ones that they have that this thing is designed to connect together. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't design something that would hook together, UGC goes to tryptophan. Actually, GC does. Oh, no. UGC goes to cysteine, I guess. Anyway, but so the point being that there, as far as I've been able to determine, there's nothing to say that you couldn't design a system that maps to different different codons to different amino acids. This has really been struggling with.
Yeah, no, the terminology is hard.
Different amino acids.
Right.
So, but anyway, so that's the part that seems the most like magical to me.
Is that like saying, like we're I feel like humans are referred to as like carbon-based life forms, or I guess all life on Earth, or most life on Earth, is referred to as carbon-based. Is that similar to saying like you could just use a different element as like a basis?
Maybe, but I think what it is it's kind of just like this agreement that happened incidentally, where these three letters translate to this thing, and then once that agreement has been like that, once that pact has been formed, like now you have biological pressure like reinforcing that stays the same.
Right. So you could start a brand new, life, and but just use different mappings, and it would be fine. It would figure it out.
Right.
That mapping would get reinforced over and over again over millennia.
That's my understanding. Now, I like all this stuff is in, and this goes back to why I was saying like it's so fantastically complicated, is because like there's a 10-minute YouTube video just explaining the process by which tRNA, which is like like that gets helicated or whatever the hell like I'm making up a word here. That's not the right word, but so anyway, but as far as I was able to determine, there's nothing to say that you couldn't design an enzyme that would arbitrarily hook some three base pair codon, some codon to an arbitrary amino acid, which that blows my mind. And like, this is the part where I'm like, I'm an atheist, but this feels like the most compelling argument for intelligent design that I've seen. Like, it seems like someone just like picked this at some point, this mapping.
But I guess if the mapping was different, like, wouldn't we have still eventually been created? I mean, obviously we would be quite different, but like it would still, life would get more and more complicated until you'd have these higher level organisms. Like, it doesn't really matter what the mapping is. You can still sort of build more and more complexity, and
right, exactly. But I guess the point is like that a mapping emerged is interesting to me. You know what I mean? Like,
why, that is interesting.
But so and like, yeah. So I don't like. I think we can move on from this point. But
I mean, that's super interesting.
These mechanisms are, and again, like it must have always been like these things started as something simpler, and they performed that essential function just poorly at first, and then they got more sophisticated. And when you look at them, you're like, oh wow, this is so sophisticated. It looks like it was created out of whole cloth, but actually it was this evolution literally of something that was kind of doing something similar. There was already maybe some simpler mapping, and then it translated into this. So
right. Yeah, the one thing that, so I feel like I get this chapter. I do love this discussion of biology and sort of these like almost formal rules that govern how biology works. I found that very interesting. And, he does compare it to a bunch of topics that he brought up before. Like he gives this table, which he calls a dog map, which is basically mapping from one dogma to another. So he maps the dogma of biology onto the dogma of mathematical logic, where you have like strands of DNA can be equated to strands of TNT, typographical number theory.
Right.
And proteins can be equated to statements of TNT. So there's all these, it's like, this is why he's been introducing all these things earlier in the book, was to sort of give us a basis so that he can discuss, this biological dog map. And I really like that. What I didn't really understand was like where Gödel's incompleteness comes into this. He had this section where he mentioned viruses, and he mentioned how, viruses are these fascinating organisms that basically like break into your system and release their own DNA, which then starts performing these weird calculations within your biology. And it almost sounded like he was comparing that to Gödel's incompleteness, but I just didn't fully get the comparison.
No,
but it was interesting.
I agree. I wasn't 100% sure how Gödel's, like how G, for example, was similar to that. I mean, unless, yeah, I mean, in a way, like I guess it's atmospherically similar because like if the cell is like the system and G comes in and then like it breaks down, but
Right. It gives
uh,
it this statement that like breaks the system.
right. There was something that was also very interesting, which was he talked about how one defense mechanism that cells produce or created to defend themselves against these invaders is they started like tagging their DNA. And they said that tagging is kind of like serifs on a font where they don't change the function of it, but it's like something you can look for. And then basically if something had DNA that wasn't tagged, it would just chop it up into small bits. Which I thought that it just I would say clever, but it was just like it feels clever.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just cool, and this just goes to show that there's so many things that you can learn from biology because I feel like there's there's I mean that's kind of like a security. It's like providing a token to
Yeah.
a back end system. Um,
Yeah. No, it is crazy how many sort of analogs there are between software and biology, and he makes a ton of them. He also talks about some of them in the dialogue, which I did read. He talks about the turntable that destroys records and how Crab came up with a mechanism for like labeling records that would like prevent them from basically Tortoise couldn't play his records on Crab's turntable because all of Crab's records were labeled. They went into this little discussion of like, oh, can Tortoise fake the label?
yeah,
But anyway, sort of similar to what you were talking about.
yeah, exactly. I did not read the dialogue.
Yeah, dude, if I'd have known how long this chapter was, I would not have read that dialogue because, man, this was a long chapter.
But I think that was all that I had. Hankin sentences felt like I wasn't really sure what exactly his point. It almost felt like the opposite of a Gödel sentence where you're like this statement is provable in this system.
Yeah.
Um, but that felt I don't know uninteresting. But I wasn't sure if you got more from that.
Not really. I felt like the meat of this chapter, I found it really interesting. There was a few interludes that, like, I really like the interlude where he talked about how does it ladder up to an elephant. He talked about another element of which is like cascading, where we briefly mentioned how proteins have these activation sites, which cause chemistry and biology to happen, maybe produces new materials. But then that new material then can land on other proteins. And so you get this cascading effect. And a lot of biology, or a lot of the reason biology is so complicated is because of this cascading effect. And I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, that's about all I had for this chapter. I mean, it was a super long chapter, so I feel like we could talk about it for hours, but I think that was, kind of an overview.
Oh yeah. No, I mean just to your point about I mean, proteins just sound like these superpower that can operate at any layer of abstraction. They can operate on DNA. They can operate on other and like you're saying with these chains, like sometimes proteins are like they're getting generated and then they're creating new enzymes, which are operating on other enzymes. So like it's all of these. This is the part where you were talking about how like there's no rationality. It's like yeah, it's this extremely chaotic thing. The other thing that's
Yeah.
wild to me is like if you're decode or like if the ribosome right, it's creating a protein all of the little codon things, all of the possible codons that could like attach, they just need to be like around. They just need to be like floating around. And it just needs
Yeah.
to happen to like, okay, it's like the probability just needs to be high enough that it clicks into place. It's not like it can go out and actually grab one. It's just like by probability. There's just like, but is there just a trillion of every single possible, just like floating around in the cell all the time?
Yeah, that's why I got to eat your vegetables.
Yeah. Yeah. Make sure you, yeah, take eat some protein powder.
Yeah, some omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, it's important. All right. Well, that is all I had as well. But this was a good one.
Yeah, a good one. Yeah, looking forward to the next one.
All right, I will see you next time. And so we are doing something slightly different for the rest of the chapters. It sounds like instead of going one by one, we're going to kind of do broad overviews over a couple of chapters at a time for the next couple episodes, just as a heads up. So,
right. Yeah, we love this book, but it is vast, and we think you should read it.
A vast tome, yes, you should definitely read it. And we think we want to start talking about something other than Gödel's theory of incompleteness.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will see you next time, John.
See you next time, Matt.